Hello, my name is Tii Ricks, and welcome to my podcast show called Something Positive. Each week, I'm very lucky I get to speak to some amazing people who at times have gone through some very challenging life situations, but not everyone. The one thing in common with everyone I do speak with is they want to be able to share some of the positive angles and silver linings that they've learned throughout life. So tune in and remember, no matter what you're going through, you're not alone. Hi, Amelia. Welcome to my podcast called Something Positive. How are you this evening, by the way?
I'm very good, thank you. Hi.
Hi, hello. I'm really excited to talk to you this evening about, I think, a topic that I think is not really that much talked about, especially nowadays. And that topic is really about growing up with toxic ideologies and what impact that has on a person's life. Now, before we go into that topic just in more detail, it would be really great to hear more for our viewers as well and people listening in. Who are you? And if you can kind of explain a little bit more about yourself and, who you are and what you do.
No problem. Hi, I'm Amelia. I am a transgender woman. I've created a bit of a social media platform at the moment. And about myself, I am a parent. I have a fiance. We've been together for nearly 8 years. And I grew up as a Jehovah's Witness.
In terms of this topic about talking about growing up with toxic ideologies and what impact that has, especially on you, I guess, in this case, why is this topic, of interest to you? Why is this something that you felt like, you want to come on this podcast and talk about it?
I think because of my experience with social media and obviously seeing a lot of the bad comments, seeing a lot of the hate and the way people act towards, especially people in my position, and I feel a great deal of pity for these people. I feel almost sorry for them because I know how I grew up, and these people are acting in the same way that I may have acted in the past, and I can see myself in them. And I wish that I could almost share my story with them so they can see how they can improve.
Yeah. Well, you're here on this podcast, so this is, I think, a good platform to kind of share a bit more about your story, and maybe it can change some people's minds. Now, the topic, I think, is an interesting one, like we mentioned, and, the whole idea of this podcast is also not just sharing kind of like the things that impacted and the negative, but also looking at some of the positives that come through it as well. But before we go into there, I just want to get a bit more of a background on just get to know you as well. I think the viewers would love to get to know you a bit more. Where did you grow up, Amelia? What kind of family did you have?
I grew up in the northeast of England, and I was the eldest of 6, although my youngest sister wasn't born until I was 20, so most of the eldest of 4 or 5 throughout my life. Grew up in not the most affluent area. We were quite poor as a family, so that's basically the way I grew up.
And you said, was it kind of like a small village? Was it like a city environment? Where you, if you can kind of tell some people maybe who don't know exactly what kind of area that is, what kind of area is it? How would you describe it?
It's kind of a sort of a suburban type of area. It more sort of like less developed areas. The place I grew up in, Cramlington, was a new town, but we lived at sort of the outskirts of it, and it wasn't always the best of areas, but it wasn't a horrible area to live. It wasn't like high crime or anything like that. It was still a nice-ish town. So yeah, that's kind of the environment.
Interesting. And you mentioned, so you grew up as a Jehovah's Witness, or that was your family. Was that your entire family? Was that the area that you lived in? Was it common to be Jehovah's Witnesses, or was that something unusual?
No, it's quite a small religion. If you look at numbers of people in the world, it is quite sect-like and almost cult-like in some respects. It's a religion based upon Christianity, but almost like a fervent stickler to the rules in the Bible. My parents were joined when I was aged 5, so probably 1984, 1985 sort of time, and it was because they were searching for some sort of hope. They'd been Church of England previously, and they didn't feel that was enough for them, and somebody came knocking on the door, as they do, and they started studying that religion.
Interesting. In terms of, like you mentioned, okay, so that's like interesting that you use the word cult. Like, I guess my question is, why do you use that word? What makes it feel, or what didn't make it feel like a cult, I guess?
There was a high amount of passion involved, as in they are very zealous in their works. They are very segregated in the way they live their lives. They live their lives by, we are in the world but no part of the world type of thing, so they don't hang out and associate with people who are not within the religion, and it makes it very difficult for people to leave the religion. Obviously, we'll talk about that in a bit. But also, it gives you a sense of community while you are in there, that you're going to be looked after, that you are safe, which can be a bad thing in some respects as well, because it cuts you off from the outside world.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, I don't have an experience of that, but it sounds like, in that sense that you kind of grew up in that environment kind of gets all those kind of the right feels if you put the word cult in there. Would you say like, did you have a lot of friends from outside of that community that weren't in that? So was you completely kind of cut off from the world at that point?
I mean, we went to secular school, at least in the earlier part of my life, so I made friends at school as such, but we weren't allowed to hang out with them after school. Um, we slowly sort of drew away from family members. I was very close to my cousins. I have three girl cousins, Debbie, Julie, and Donna, who I was very close to as a young child, but we were sort of pushed away from them, and we were pushed to associate with people within the church, basically.
Interesting. Wow. How did you kind of find it? How did you see the world? How did you view the world when you were growing up in that kind of environment? What was that normal for you? Did you ever feel like that, something's not right? Or yeah, if you can explain
Well,
a bit more about that kind of side of things.
it's interesting you should say that, because obviously recently I've been diagnosed with a couple of neurodivergencies, ADHD and with traits of autism spectrum disorder, and one of the traits of that is being quite hyper focused on things. Now, when my parents joined that religion, I was about age 5 year old, and I was so enthusiastic because I wanted to please everybody, have a very people pleasing approach, and if anything, I hyper focused on that religion for many, many years. I did, as I got older, start to question certain things. I'd had my own issues with gender and that sort of thing, which had been well pushed out of the way. But I created almost a personality around that, and around pleasing people, and around being the best I could be within that religion, because it was all I knew.
And what about the family dynamic? What was it like growing up in that family of yours?
I mean, very much of its time in some respects, but it was also very strict and almost, shall we say, abusive, because the religion encourages the parents to beat the children. It encourages them to keep them strict and keep them separate from everybody else. And we were punished even for being fidgety within the church meetings and so on. So it's a very harsh environment, but also it did feel very two-faced to me. And this is a big thing from when I think back, in that my parents obviously at home were a certain way, but were in public with the actual other people from the religion, we all presented this perfect family who were so good as gold, and they were they concentrated on making us appear to be perfect. And obviously, kids aren't. We aren't perfect at that age. You're going to be naughty. You're going to try out new things and so on. But obviously, it was that kind of that persona that they wanted to push out.
That's quite intense. I mean, in terms of, I think it's, I don't belong myself into any sort of religious background or haven't been brought up in that kind of way. I do have some friends who, very in a similar sense, they weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, but along those lines. And I remember hearing stories a little bit about that kind of very strict kind of background. Is that where you kind of feel the toxic? Where I guess my question here is like, where did you feel like the toxicity came in? I know you said like you were, there was abuse going on or things like that. But when did you kind of realize that? When did you kind of realize that, there was toxicity coming into the upbringing here?
Well, the way the religion is very patriarchal for starters. It pushes that the man is head of the household. It is very well. It's not very supportive to women generally. Um, any sort of expression of femininity, any sort of expression of anything other than just archetypical family type is considered wrong and is almost bullied out of people. I have my own personal experience with gender because of that. I was quite feminine. I was quite delicate as a child, um, and yet that was pushed away. And obviously, I was pressurized to be more masculine and to be like a future head of a household type of thing. Um, and obviously, they don't approve of anything to do with variations of sexuality. Anything LGBTQ basically is considered a detestable sin, and those people will be wiped away from the planet when the Earth is renewed in the future. So you are encouraged to consider yourself elite and better than everybody else because you are you have found this religion and you are practicing within this religion, and you look down upon the rest of the world as being, not so great. And it is a very, very poisonous viewpoint. And unfortunately, because of my obsession to try and please people, I didn't recognize this until I was into my sort of late teens and early 20s, before I started to be able to realize that this was a problem. And even now, I mean, I'm 43 years old, and I can look back and see that I've kept certain ideologies far into my adult life and had to unpack them over the past few years.
How did that, I guess, when you were growing up and you have this conflict between kind of like you're saying, the feminine side and all this, how the religion is kind of against that. How did that feel to you? I guess, like, how did you cope with that? I guess my question here is more about the feeling that you went through, right? Like, what was going on in your mind during that time?
For me, it was being never good enough. It was never being enough, never being manly enough, never being the right for that. I always felt that there was something missing, that I was wrong. I always had this fear that everyone was looking at me and laughing at me, kind of thing, because I was different from everyone else. Obviously, the diagnosis of the neurodivergencies has pointed to something that was different, but again, most of that was overshadowed by this constant need to be a performer, to be perfect, and to be like almost an act all of the time. And it's, again, that goes hand in hand with these sort of the autistic traits as well. The fact that I had to put on a persona to become something I wasn't. And it did have some benefits, because obviously I learned to do public speaking. I learned to have the courage to go and knock on a stranger's door. Things like that, which have set me up for things in later life and have helped me. But I think the damage was more intense. That was being done gradually over the time. And the psychological side of it as well.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, again, I think from a psychological perspective, if something is the norm, in a sense, you well, that's the way life is.
Yeah.
From personal story, I remember when I was growing up, there was this ideology in my mind that it's like, this is my normal day. Every day is like this. Everyone else thinks the same. Did you have a feeling like that as well? Did you feel like, did you ever feel like you could talk to someone? And did you ever notice that someone else was struggling the same way? Did you feel like that is the norm? What you were
Yeah.
going through as well, or did you kind of feel like, yeah?
100%, 100%. You are, and it gets referred to as brainwashing, and it is exactly that. You are programmed almost from a young age that is how it is supposed to be, that this is the way it is, and anyone who sort of makes a noise or anyone who sort of rebels against it is wrong, and is they've been corrupted by somebody else, and you are led to believe that you are 100% right. And it is a very, very singular minded, and it's funny because obviously in other sort of ideologies and other situations in life, I've seen the same thing happening to other people, whether it be religion, whether it be political viewpoints and so on, where people are almost programmed in to believe that nobody else's viewpoints exist and that they are 100% right. It's quite a toxic environment because you can't see it.
What about your siblings? Did your siblings understand you? Did you were able to like talk to your siblings about this? Was there anyone at that, when you were a young age, that you could kind of feel like is relating to you in some way?
I didn't feel that there was, to be honest with you. And when we did leave home eventually, a lot of us went our separate ways, and a lot of us, I didn't feel I did. I sort of performed well into my adulthood. Well, a lot of my siblings kind of went off the rails and went into a more sort of seedy lifestyle. So a lot of them got involved in drugs and alcohol. And it was quite common among Jehovah's Witness children to either be absolute goody two-shoes and perfect when they grew up, or they completely rebelled and went the opposite way. And we were shielded from that, because the second somebody does start to go down that route, they are ejected from the religion, they are disfellowshipped and removed, so that they're not causing, should we say, other people to follow their path. So people did get lost along the way, as it were, including my own family. And I mean, that should have been a big red flag at the time, but again, you are brainwashed to believe that what you are doing is right. So no, I didn't feel it with anyone else, because everyone else who was even in the slightest bit questioning would have been pushed away from the church so as not to corrupt everyone else.
That sounds like a very lonely time, growing up. Kind of thinking again. You had probably this inner dialogue within yourself, like something's not right, but what you see around you is like the normal. I mean, that sounds, yeah, like a very lonely path. Do you have like I guess, in a more kind of personal question, in the sense that Do you have like an early memory, something that was kind of stuck with you until this day, where you felt like the toxicity was really clearly evident? Is there something that you remember that's has stuck with you until today?
Yes, funny you should say that. And it's the actual subject itself is irrelevant, but it's how it was dealt with. And one of the things that was taught was that in the future, when uh, the earth is renewed and everyone's resurrected and brought back from the dead, because that was one of the beliefs that they had, that they instead of going to heaven, it was inhabit the earth. But those who were resurrected, and the actual verse says that they will be like angels in heaven, neither marrying nor giving in marriage, which basically meant that once you died and come back again, you couldn't have a partner. And I wanted to question that, and other people wanted to question that, but every time anyone brought that up was, that doesn't seem right. I don't think God would do that sort of thing, because they were shut down. They were shut down, and the conversation was always, this is what the scripture says, this is what it is the case. We don't question it. And what they would do is, obviously there was no backwards and forwards, there was no debate on anything. Everything was controlled by a central governing body of people who then, they would rethink things, and they'd come back with new beliefs and go, actually, there's been new light on this, we've sat and we prayed together, etc. When in essence, all they'd done is debated it in a room and decided that it was going to change. But I recognised that kind of controlling system there, because we were shut down when we were questioning things. And that hurt, because I was getting to a point where my own mind was working. I was getting to a point where I thought, well, actually, this should be reviewed. And no, us little people were told to just get on with it and accept it the way it was. So that was my earliest memory of it being wrong.
Did you ever feel that from whether from family or from external, like from the society that you were growing up with? Did you ever feel like someone maybe spotted that in you, this little bit of this rebel, who's trying to question things? Did you ever feel that they were trying to suppress you even more? Was there any moments like that you felt like someone's trying to single you out and trying to brainwash you to, to see the correct path? I guess.
I don't actually think so, because I think, going back to what I said earlier on about the sort of neurodivergent urge to fit in, apart from that one moment where I obviously spoke up and was shut down, I did used to do exactly what I was told. I was the golden boy. How I don't like to say that, but obviously I was at the time. Um, and I was the perfect child, the eldest child, and I was the perfect one, and one everyone looked up to. And yeah, I walked the walk and talked the talk at the time. I suppose in my teen years, then I started to change. When I started battling with the issues that I had during puberty, then I didn't know, but still I felt like I had to present this perfect image. So yeah, I don't think they did recognise it. I was so completely immersed in it that I couldn't see it until I left home, which was actually complete change for me, actually having my own life when I was like 19, 20, and realizing that I could actually make decisions. So no, it was not something that came out very early on.
Interesting. We'll go into that quite a little bit as well. I'm just curious, like what was the actual thing that led you to leave home? But just more on your family and just curiosity. You mentioned that that your family kind of, I guess, moved into that area and they became Jehovah's Witnesses. Was that, do you know, was that something that your family was always been very religious and they just found this? I don't know what you want to call it, a sect or whatever you want to call it, but is something that you feel like your family was always guided to, or did they get brainwashed somehow into it? I mean, of course, clearly in some ways, but I guess my point is, how did they end up in that situation?
Well, as I say, they were Church of England. They got me christened when I was sort of 3 or 4 years old. There was there was pressure, obviously, from other family members to be religious, but they didn't like the religion that they were they were born into, or they were set to join. So they were looking for something, and it was coincidence basically that obviously Jehovah's Witnesses like to proselytize, they like to knock on doors and try to recruit people to their religion, and it was just timing basically. The elderly couple who knocked on the door and spoke to my parents were really kind and caring people, very understanding, and it's something clicked basically, and they studied the religion and they joined, and it was just fortuitous or unfortunate timing, if you get my drift. So yeah, there was nothing specific. I think being told things like, obviously the pressure was on to get me christened by the church, because if there was something happened to me, they couldn't have a funeral at the church and things like that, made them question it. And the fact that the church was very strict in their rules and so on was something they weren't happy with. So yeah, and that is something that quite often happens with people who join the Jehovah's Witness religion, is they've been disillusioned with something of themselves, or they've had a big event happen in their life, like they've lost a loved one or something, and they're looking for hope, because everyone's looking for some sort of hope, something for the future.
Yeah, I think that's the big thing. I mean, I've lost my father when he was quite young, when I was quite young, and like you said, everyone looks for hope, and whether that's religion or other means, it's always something. And I think that's where it's quite scary, where some people can end up because of that. Look for hope, and it sounds like maybe your family kind of I don't know what event other than that maybe drove your family there, but it's surely had some dire consequences. I can tell. Um, what does toxic, I guess, ideology mean to you? I think everyone might have a different view of what that actually means to them. Now we're talking a little bit here about religion and the background you have, but what does it mean to you? Like, what is it?
It's something that is instilled in you as being fact and, should we say, the right thing to do, but in actual fact, it harms people and stops people from being themselves. For instance, obviously, anything to do with racism, anything to do with like homophobia, transphobia, anything to do with obviously one religion being correct and the others not being correct, that sort of thing. If your beliefs then tell somebody else in the world that they are wrong, that's where it becomes toxic, because you can have a belief, and this is what I must do. The second you use it to bash somebody else and force somebody else to change their ways, then it becomes toxic, because we're all human beings with our own free will, and that's where the problem lies. You've also got the homophobia side, which was a big one. My parents were very anti-gay, and anything that was kind of considered camp or effeminate was very much the worst thing. But it was more than just a religion. It was like it was already there. Especially my father was very much along those lines, and that was instilled in me at a young age. That certain artists, obviously Boy George was big around when I was young, where you don't listen to that. You don't listen to Queen, because that's they were all. I won't say any of the slurs that they would say, but it was very much drummed into us that was the worst thing you could be. And that is very toxic, because if you can disregard a whole group of human beings because of how they are born and how they are as a person, who they love. That's toxicity. That, because you don't see them as human beings, you don't see them as somebody, and the only way that you could ever see them as human beings is if they repent from their sins and change their ways.
I think what scares me about when talking about toxic ideology is that this spans across so many different, not just Jehovah's Witnesses, not just what you went through. It's everywhere, right? It's the whole fact that once a group of people decide like what we live by is correct, and if you question it, how dare you? Are you? I guess this is a bit of a challenging question, but since you went through that upbringing, and I know you mentioned you have children, and I'm not saying that it's directed towards your child, but have you ever thought that what you went through as a child, was there any moment in time that you felt like afraid that, oh my gosh, what if I do the same? What if I would do the same to my child or to anyone else? Not necessarily the same, ideology, but putting some of those practices in place. Was there a moment in time that you felt that?
There's a couple of things I could talk about on that subject. The first one is obviously you get parents do one of two things, or sort of children who then go on to have their own kids will either do exactly as their parents did, or they do the complete opposite. And you often find it's one or the other. With myself, I actually delayed having a child for quite a long time, and when I eventually did, I vowed I would not be like my parents, because I knew the damage that it had done. I vowed that I wouldn't put my child through that. However, there are certain things that I pushed onto my child from an early age that came from my upbringing. For instance, I wouldn't let my little one get involved with anything to do with guns and violence, and just even toy guns, that sort of thing. I kept all that completely away from him for a long period of time. Computer games, well, as he was getting older, and that came from my upbringing, that whole sort of and yes, I am a pacifist, but a lot of it was drummed into me by the religion. The Christmas, obviously, that religion don't celebrate Christmas. I struggled many years to come to kind of love Christmas. I still have a funny relationship with Christmas now, but I think in early years maybe I didn't put enough sort of gusto and feeling into the whole selling the Christmas story, and my little one gave up on the Christmas spirit kind of thing quite early on, and said to, I mean, he's an intelligent young lad, and he said to me, Father Christmas is the same as Jesus. It's a story made up to make people behave. So yeah, I think maybe in a lot of ways I passed down some of my upbringing, but hopefully it hasn't had a negative effect. Obviously, I didn't force my child to have any particular views. I've always been very open, and like that all different groups of people exist, and the fact that everyone's different and that no one set of rules or lifestyle is correct. So in a lot of ways, yes, I've gone the exact opposite, but yeah, there are little themes that do come from that you then you bring back into your personality and your lifestyle.
Yeah, exactly. I can understand that. And just back, because I remember that question, that kind of sentence that you said, that you left at the age of, what was it, 18, 19? You mentioned.
I left home at that age, yes, and I didn't officially leave the region until my mid-20s, but I faded away basically.
So you left home. What does that mean? So you stay in the region. So were you still kind of associated with that kind of that sect of people, or in terms of, talk to me about that? Like, what does that mean, leaving home at
Well,
19?
I famously remember my mother saying to me, "I think we'd get on better if you didn't live here." Quite a painful thing for a young. At the end of the day, when you're in your late teens, you're still a young child, and your mother basically saying that you would be better off if you didn't live there. They helped me set up my first flat and get myself started. I had a job. I learnt to drive. I was very self-sufficient, but I still only had friends within that church, and even up until the point when I got married for the first time at age 21, I still was associating with exactly the same people. My then wife was somebody who I'd met within that church, and we got married in a religious wedding. And it wasn't until we started to try and live our lives sort of in the real world, we realised that we didn't need everyone else around us. We didn't need this whole community constantly in our pockets, because they would judge us for everything we did or didn't do, and we just wanted to live our own life. And she was very instrumental in that, because obviously she was a couple of years younger than me. She was 18 and I was 21 when we got married. So young. I don't recommend that to anybody, and we only lasted 4 years. But during that time, we did question a lot of things. We did start to explore. She explored her sexuality. I explored sort of like my femininity, things like that at that age. It did sort of end in the marriage failing, and we kind of went our separate ways. But it did actually help, because we'd drawn away from the whole group of people and just started to live our own lives we'd made new friends at work and that sort of thing. So it was instrumental in pulling me away from that, the fact that we had each other.
That's interesting. And do you remember, what age were you roughly when you really kind of felt like, oh, you know what, I'm now quite far away from what I was going through as, growing up, and you realized, that was wrong. That was all kind of not the way that it should have been.
It was. I was in mid-20s, yeah, and it was the way we were treated by those, because we weren't as active in the church anymore because we'd gone our own way. We were sort of like pushed to one side, and the only way that we could get friends was to then go back to the church and spend time with them. And after we parted and we'd started the divorce proceedings and all that sort of thing, I went back to the church to repent and say, hi, I'm back. Can you please accept me back? I need my friends around me again. The church leaders basically sat down and they did a disfellowshipping, which is cutting you off from the church. Now, they said that this was a kindness and it was to help me sort of become a better person, but they basically cut me off completely and isolated me. I had nobody around me, because they decided that I was, I'd been away from the church enough of a time that I could be a toxic influence or someone who questioned things. And they wanted to keep me separate, alone, and I had to prove for a period of anywhere from 6 months to a year or whatever that I was, faithful enough to then come back. And that hurt me at the time, because I'm a social person. I might be autistic, but I still need people around me. And it was that was the final straw. And I was 24, 25 sort of time. And I was lost. I was suffering from severe depression. I didn't know who I was as a person. And that was a tough time in my life, and they basically cut me off instead of welcoming back. Like they always preach that love. Oh, we welcome back the prodigal son who comes back. They didn't. They didn't take me back at all. They pushed me into a corner to say, prove yourself, then you can come back.
That sounds really harsh. I'm sorry that you had to go through that. Was there anyone else in besides the the person that you kind of were able to, I guess, feel that same vibe? Was there any other ones that you connected with afterwards that from that same region that kind of left and felt the same as you as well?
Well, no, because they were so successful at segregating people who had moved on. So everyone who I used to be friends with was either still in the church or they'd gone their own way and were completely separate. To be fair, I don't think apart from one or two that I've spoken to on Facebook over the years, I've not really spoken to anyone who's left the religion in any great depth, because it's almost like although we have the shared trauma from that, there is a specific thing called religious trauma, which I've had to have therapy for myself. And people don't tend to flock back together again. So I did have to start from scratch. And when I was in my 20s, I met somebody online. I moved to a completely new part of the country, 350 miles south, and started a whole new life basically after that. Got married, took on some stepchildren, had a child of my own, and that was me trying to live a normal life because I didn't know who I was and what I wanted. And I was successful at it for about 10 years. Yeah, and that worked out for me at the time as my getaway, because I had nothing. I had like one suitcase full of clothes, and I was out on my ear type thing. So it was an interesting time for me, and it was definitely painful. But again, I'm quite resilient as a person, and I've found this over the years. I've built up a resilience to go, I'm going to start from scratch and build this up again. And although I still feel I kept on a lot of those toxic viewpoints, I was still quite homophobic, etc., in my views, etc. Still very not considerate of other people, still reasonably selfish as a person. I did start again in my mid-20s.
That's really amazing. I mean, I know that you're on TikTok. I've also become a follower of yours. The way that you kind of talk to people is it's so just it's just such an amazing thing to see. Like, to think we're talking today about what you kind of lived through and the upbringing to kind of get to know who you are now. There's no way I would have ever, seen that at all. And then, like you said, you've done a lot of work. In terms of, I guess this is an interesting question, and I think this is something I like to ask people on this podcast a little bit, is that, given what you've gone through, do you feel that is there a sense of guilt in any way of this? Do you feel like you've done anything to deserve that? I guess that experience that you went through, in the sense of that you maybe you did something along the way. Did you ever feel that kind of moment in your life?
There's a multifaceted answer to that one, I would say, because first of all, I feel the whole guilt of being different. I felt the guilt of being, because obviously I've known from a very young age I was meant to be a girl. I knew from a very young age that I was wrong. I also knew that my mind didn't work the same way as everyone else's with my neurodivergency, and those were a big thing of guilt. And every time that I've become quite a people pleaser. I've become someone who is, because of that trauma, I'm on edge all the time. Even to this day, even with all the work I've done since then, I'm on edge all the time. And so yes, there is a certain amount of guilt. So when I look back, and instead of going, that was a bad way to be brought up, sometimes I go, but did I deserve it? So that's one side of things. But there's also the way that I've acted in my adult life, and the fact that I carried on some of those toxic ideas. The fact that I played the part of the typical man in my second marriage, and pretty much destroyed my second marriage by being inconsiderate, by being selfish, by being lazy, by not thinking about her feelings and so on, because I was still acting the act. I was still trying to be somebody that I wasn't, and still trying to live out. Okay, I'd understood that, I needed to be more accepting to people. I knew that I'd got, but I didn't realise how many of my own ideology, especially patriarchal and misogynistic ideas, that were still running through that. And it wasn't until my second marriage broke down in, where should we say, the 2010s, now we're talking, when I'm in my 30s, that I realised that I still had a lot of work to do. And that's the thing, I still have a lot of guilt now from how I acted in my adult life. Well, so there's two lots to that.
In terms of the, I guess, the impact for you, like you kind of mentioned the depression and all that, and you went to get therapy. What other kind of impact did it really have? Like, and I'm talking about like, what other kind of, I don't want to use the word negative, but what are the darker things that it caused you, this upbringing from a toxic perspective?
So obviously, my first port of call is the misogyny, because obviously I've been brought up to be man and live socialized male in that respect, but also in that very patriarchal religion. I had a lot of sort of feelings about how I was supposed to act, and yeah, that was one of the negative effects. And it's something over the past few years. Now, in 2016, I met a lovely woman who I'm still with now to this day, and she has brought out all the best parts in my personality, which, as far as she is concerned and as far as everyone else is concerned, have always been there. I've always been known to be a kind person. I've always been known to be a person who wants to please other people, who wants to make other people happy. I've just always had the wrong information. And this brings me on to the whole reason for this subject. The fact that my personality was good from the start, but because of the way I was brought up, I was moulded into somebody who was toxic. Even in amongst that toxicity, I still had that reasonably pure heart. I had somebody who wanted to do the right thing. And that was always a conflict within me, because I could see that a lot of things I was doing weren't correct. I could see that I wasn't being kind to people, but I didn't know how to rectify that. And I do believe there are other people out there who are in the same situation, who've got these negative effects running through them. And obviously that then, coupled with the gender dysphoria and the undiagnosed neurodivergence, meant that I was a very depressed person. Now, Claire, my partner, has stuck with me through some tough times over the past few years, and it wasn't until January 2022 that I had a moment of, well, my boss and my friend at the time, she contacted not so much the emergency services, but services out there to intervene and say, okay, this person needs some help. And it was realising that she'd actually taken that step that I was so close to the end of calling it a day, that I vowed to get therapy. And that was the start of my journey to who I am now, getting that therapy and unpacking a lot of toxicity that still existed. Also, the trauma that hadn't been resolved from childhood, even from my adult life, and understanding what parts of me, what parts of me were the little girl I always was and never got to grow up as, and, you know, who I am as a person. So the negativity was that sort of the shell that I built around myself to create this character that it harmed other people in some respects. I feel guilt towards my sort of second marriage and the fact that it went wrong because of me and because of who I acted as. So yeah, there's a lot of negativity.
Yeah, it's actually interesting because I was actually talking yesterday in one of the episodes that I was making, and talking about, how people. I guess we always try to do the good thing. I mean, most of us, not every one of us, but most of us always try to do good. But because of the learned behavior that we have, the like you said, the toxicity, the ideologies that are placed within us from a young age, a lot of us don't necessarily come out of that and realize that what they're doing is wrong. And then, they might be trying to do good, but they're actually harming more. And I think that's an important one. My question for you is, Amelia, what are the right tools for someone who might be in that sense, whatever toxicity that they're going through? How could we help, or how could you think that society or anyone can help people, give them the tools quite early on to realize that they're living in that kind of toxic state?
I think it's a hard one because a lot of these ideologies, as we would call them, are very deeply ingrained. For instance, the whole one about the gender and the gender norms are taught to us from a very young age. The only way that I've seen this myself and been able to unpack this is by other people who are visibly open as themselves, whether it be gay people, whether it be transgender people, whether it be people who are actively into feminism and saying this is the way we should be, taking that risk and putting themselves out there. And you look at them as a person who's trying to do good and go, that there is a good person. That there is another human being that my thoughts are then condemning and saying that they're in the wrong. So you get a conflicting thing. I mean, yes, I'm sure there are some really hateful people in this world who do not see other people as human beings no matter what because of the way they are as a person. But I reckon the bulk of people just want everyone to get along, just want everyone to be happy. They will smile at somebody in the street because that person is another human being going through the same battles as them. And it's understanding that they're still a person who deserves respect, in spite of them having a different way of life, a different background, different colour skin, a different sexuality, a different view on life. They're still another human being who has every right to be living their life as they want to and as they are. And until that person can see that, and it is the actual click over to see that is difficult. I have had some people who've said to me during my time of being on social media, "You've changed my viewpoint on that." And as a person who wants to do good, that there is absolute warming to my heart. One person who may have said that 6 months ago they thought a certain way has said, "Do you know what? I'm starting to unpack and think about that." They might not get it first time, but it's that first moment of going, "Do you know what? I've been looking at this wrong," which is one of the reasons I try to present myself as a human being, first of all. I don't want to sit there and preach anyone. I don't want to sit there and push anything down anyone's throat, as they say. I'm not going to sit there publishing all my feminist views. I'm not going to sort of dance around and say, yeah, I'm trans, love me. I'm going to say I'm a human being. I wake up in the morning with aches and pains like everyone else. I go to the shop and the bread's gone up in price. I am a human being doing my housework, getting annoyed at the traffic, those sort of things, the things people can relate to, and it's humanity where we all must meet. And only by seeing the humanity in everybody can we start to unpack those beliefs.
I totally agree with you there. And another thing that came to mind as well, I remember I've got a good friend. She works in social services, helps very difficult situations where children are at and things like that. And I remember she spoke about like the power of words. And this is what I really like about what you do on social media, on TikTok, is that, I've seen people, some comments are not always necessarily the nicest comments and things like that. I guess that's, that happens. But I think the power that you have, Amelia, is that I think you're very how would I word it? You're using very good words, because I think you're using words that people can easily understand. And what I mean by that is everyone has a different understanding of what a word might mean. Let's say, if I say I'll be there in a second, for someone a second could be like literally in 2 seconds or 10 minutes, and for someone else it might mean tomorrow, right? So but the way that you're also kind of, I guess one of my pointed to this topic is that words also have an impact in terms of how you unpack the toxicity in other people as well, right? Potentially that whatever upbringing they've had, it's about teaching and educating people to think about what the words they're using as well. Would you agree with that statement?
Definitely. And a lot of times when someone is talking with and someone's making a clumsy comment, I will say to them, "Doesn't bother me, but have you thought about how this could affect somebody else? Have you thought about how somebody in this position could feel about that?" I know that that's what you mean, but sometimes it could come across another way. So sometimes education is the way forward as well, and sharing. And I think social media can be a powerful tool because we can talk to each other and we can say, let's think about it, how it would make someone else feel. I've got a couple of my new ideologies that I've created to help sort of combat my previous ones. So one is, they say that you should treat others how you want to be treated, but we need to go one step further and treat others how they want to be treated. Because you might be able to cope with something, you might be able to cope with the worst situation in the world. It doesn't mean to say somebody else should be able to or can. So you need to think about what they would feel.
Yeah.
So that's one big
I agree.
thing.
And it's actually funny that yeah, I agree with that. It's funny that you said that, because actually it came as a topic yesterday as well. And my view as well is, like you said, I believe in that, in sense, like, yes, I want to be treated the way that I'm treated, but I'm a singular person, right? I understand me. But like you said, like, especially let's take if someone comes from a toxic environment, from upbringing or whatever situation, they might think, you know what, this is the norm. Like, I've always been treated like this. I've always been treated like crap. Therefore, I'm fine to be treated like crap, and therefore I will treat others like crap. That might be something that other people think as well. And I think that's a powerful thing. Like you said, I think treat others like they want to be treated, and teaching them, like, this is who I am. This is how I would like you to treat me. I think that's a very powerful statement. I think that's part of the key there, Amelia. In terms of just touching on the social side a little bit in terms of and this topic, what have you taken away from, like, if you think about toxic ideologies, your upbringing, how has that helped you in the social lens? Like, how do you see it helping you on the social side? You touched there a little bit, but I'm just curious to see if there's anything more that you've kind of pondered on.
I think it gives me a unique perspective on the world. I think being what I am as well as who I am, in a lot of respects, means that I've seen a toxic masculinity or toxic patriarchal upbringing. I've been conditioned in that way. I've managed to unpack it. I see the differences between that and between a feminist viewpoint. I see the differences between a very religious viewpoint and a very agnostic viewpoint. I can now sort of walk in both worlds, and something I've always had a knack for doing. Even when I first moved down to this part of the country, my first job was working with a group of people who were Plymouth Brethren, and they ran their company. There was most of the people there were of that religion, but they obviously needed a workforce, and there was a bit of a disconnect between them and the workforce. I was able to almost be a mediator because I understood their sort of strict mentality, understood the way they were being brought up. I could have a compassion for that, but also then sort of walk in both worlds kind of thing. So it has given me a really unique perspective on life, having unpacked that. Because I have compassion for everyone, I have respect for both sides of things. I understand how someone can have a strict upbringing, have a very, very narrow religious view of something, and still be a nice person underneath. It is possible to be toxic, but also be a good person, if that makes some sort of sense. I can see the person below. So when someone comes in with hate, or someone comes to me with a bad take on something, or is inconsiderate to others, I know that there is a decent person under there. So having been through that myself, I think I can see it in a unique way.
In terms of, because of this topic, or this podcast is about, talking about something positive. I think there's a lot of positives that you mentioned here so far. What would you say is, like, if you were to, let's say you were to teach, a group of people, this is your life story, what would be like the key takeaway? What would be the biggest positive, or the positives that you say, because of this experience, you're now able to do X, Y, and Z? Or what would you say to other people? This is the positive that I found from this.
So I think some parts of my upbringing have enabled me to be courageous. I think putting myself out there and facing my fears has been a big sort of takeaway from my upbringing, and being able to do that is whether I was within that environment, having to restart my life again for several situations. I've that bravery and that courage that it is taken to do that has enabled me to step on to the next step every step of the way. But again, being able to look back, like I said, with a compassion towards the people that I used to be, and obviously that, coupled with my sort of neurodivergent and almost chaotic view of the world, gives me, like I say, it's a unique perspective, and it's an understanding of the human nature as a whole, because I've been there and I've done that. Just because I can see that it was wrong doesn't mean to say that I would then turn my back on anyone else who's in that situation. So it's going back to those people who are now in that unique situation of being brought up in a toxic way or having a certain ideology, have a massive opportunity to then not only improve themselves, but also pass that message on to other people, understand the people around them, go, have you ever thought about how we are affecting this? A classic example of that is in the case of when you get men starting to get into feminism, and they are more powerful to say to their fellow men, we shouldn't be doing this. Them saying that to the person alongside them is more powerful than 300 women saying you shouldn't be doing that. Same goes for someone who's a more open-minded viewpoint against a more narrow viewpoint. If someone who's within that kind of community can then turn on to their fellow religious person or politically right-wing person or whatever and say, have you seen what we are doing? Look at this. And that is more powerful. So me coming from that background and then being able to pass that on to others will have a knock-on effect, and we can infect humanity with positivity, with open-mindedness, and we can become better people generally through just associating with right people.
And if you were to say, like, anyone who's not necessarily have to had exactly the same experience of you, because that's of course impossible, but anyone who's had these, toxicity in their upbringing, do you have any sort of advice for them? Like, how how they can go about their lives and maybe find hope, or are there any support places they can go to and talk about these things? Anything that you've come across? And like, what is your advice to people like you?
I think the first one is forgiveness. You need to be able to forgive yourself for the person you've been. You need to realize that not everyone is going to like you as a person. Not everyone can forgive you. But you can only fix what you've done through your actions and by what you do going forward. Give yourself time to heal as a person, because even though you may be being the bad person, you have still been harmed, and you still need to repair and fix who you are as a person. I've had to have a lot of therapy over the years. I've been damaged myself. And while, yes, I've been in a position where I've been toxic or I've been hateful towards others, I've also had that towards me as well. And so you have to forgive yourself, give yourself time to heal, and seek help. And surround yourself with the right kinds of people. Look at your friends group. Look at who you hang out with. Is that who you want to be? Look at that person. Look at Dave, who's sort of drinking 12 pints of lager down the pub every night and racially abusing somebody on the way home, making homophobic jokes, and, he's never making anything of his life. Is he a kind of person you want to be? No. Maybe separate yourself from that if you have to separate yourself. Once you've dealt with your issues, then by all means, reconnect and give Dave some of your wisdom. But at the same time, surround yourself with the right people. Surround yourself with good people and diverse people, not like you. Classic example. Look at your friends list. Look at your Facebook friends list. Look at your friends group in real life. How many diversities do you see in there? How many people of another colour skin do you see, of a different background, of a different financial upbringing, different religion, different sexuality? If it's all exactly the same type of people, you need to look inside yourself and go, I'm creating an echo chamber for my own viewpoints here. Let's mix it up a little bit.
I completely agree with you there, Amelia. I think I think those are the fine two lessons in life. Is like, if you can surround yourself with so many different people, you learn, and you come out of that bubble as like, actually, what I've been thinking maybe isn't correct, right? It doesn't mean that you have to change your perspective. It doesn't mean you have to change your mind completely, but at least you can see there are other views out there, and then you can take what you want, right, and implement it within yourself. I think that's a very strong and very important piece of advice. The last thing I want to ask you here is that when you mentioned the word forgiveness, and this might be a bit of an interesting question, and feel free not to answer this, but do you think that forgiving the past and not just like what you did and other things, do you see like forgiving the past and those who did what they did to you is part of the picture as well, towards healing from getting away from the toxic ideologies that you're growing up with?
Yes. I mean, for instance, my parents. I forgive them for the way they acted. I know that they haven't changed. I know that they are still within that, but allowing myself to push that to one side and go, I don't hold any ill will towards them, is a very healthy thing to do. However, I would also say that it is as fine to not forget, and to remember that that is still there, that person is still not a safe person for you. You can forgive and move on from something, but keeping a memory of that situation and knowing that that person isn't right for you is still a good thing to do, and still protective of yourself. So I think forgiveness is one of those words people assume that you're going to move on from it and completely forget what happened. No, forgiveness is about letting it go and stopping it affecting you. And I'm talking about in the present as well. If you can forgive those around you who are hating you now because you know why, then you will be a more peaceful person. Another one of my little sayings I say is that offence can only be taken, not given. So if you control a situation, you refuse to take offence, you take back the power. And those people have no power over you. The same, you forgive them beforehand. And ironically, I'm going to drag this all the way back to religion. And if they actually followed the teachings of Jesus, whether you believe he was the Son of God or just a really good person, he said that to love your enemies, to love everybody in spite of who they are. And I think having that forgiveness towards people is imperative in improving the world.
Yes, I think that's that's a very powerful statement, and I completely agree with you. I live my life very much to that motto as well. And I wanted to thank you for joining me on this podcast and sharing your story and this amazing topic. And yeah, just wanted to thank you for being here.
No, it's been very good for me as well, because obviously it helps me sort of categorize some of these thoughts that have been flying around inside my head, and it's been some great questions and very thought provoking as well. So I appreciate it.
It's been a great conversation. I've really enjoyed every second of it with you. And how can people follow you if they go on, or if they're on TikTok?
So I am on TikTok as Amelia Fennec. Fennec is spelled like the fox. Foxtrot Echo November November Echo Charlie. Google Fennec Fox. It is the cutest creature in the world. Um, I'm also as Amelia Fennec on Instagram and Facebook, although I'm not as active on those platforms as well. I don't go on Twitter because, or X as it's called now, because it's quite a toxic environment. But TikTok being my best one, and I also have a Discord channel that I've got for intersectional feminism. It's quite a select group of people. We've only got about 70 members, and it's been quite a positive experience because we're starting to work together, mostly women, on certain experiences and see the parallels between trans and cisgender women. And that's been great as well. So come and look at me or come and talk to me on TikTok. Come and see some of my live streams when I'm ironing or doing the dishes, baking a cake or whatever, and, have a good chat.
Thank you so much for that, Amelia. So everyone, please do follow Amelia. She's a lovely, lovely person. It was really great to speak to you, like I said, Amelia. And last thing before I let you go is, what makes you laugh, Amelia?
Puns. I love plays on words. Jokes that involve just a little bit of that could be taken two different ways. I think it comes from my autistic nature and that sort of thing. So silly humour. I don't need complex jokes, but yeah, that sort of thing.
I think that's good. Thank you so much, Amelia.